Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Josh, Raphael's producer of White Label American. This is going to be another special episode where we're digging back in the archives and finding some great episodes that you might not have heard. And this one is with our special guest, Maurice D.B. Tamman.
Hi, everyone. Raphael Harry here, and you're listening to White Label American, a podcast where we hear stories from an immigrant or two, sometimes more. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. Welcome to another episode of White Label American. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you to our Patreon. Thank you for your support and helping us build community. And to everyone listening, you can also join in helping us build community, take us to the next level. There's a lot of stuff we like to do down the line. As a stay-at-home dad, it's a lot difficult managing this and volunteering and bringing content to you guys, especially with my little boss at home. But not complaining, but I need to get more people on the team to make sure the content, the quality of the content, it's continues to be as awesome and better than what I'm putting out. So the more you support, the better it gets. But if you can't join us on Patreon, that's fine. You can also support by liking, sharing, and subscribing, and especially giving us a positive review on iTunes. And that 5 stars. We need the 5 stars on every podcast platforms, but especially iTunes because of the algorithm. We can't compete with them big celebrities out there. We don't have the money, so that's the only way we can keep climbing up there. So keep the 5 stars and positive reviews coming in. So with that being said, and yes, we also have t-shirts at vetclothing.com. Just go to the sponsors on tab. You'll see White Label American podcast t-shirts. And yeah, get yourself a t-shirt of your favorite color. So with that being said, I introduce today's guest. He's an author, a sailor, and he says sometimes journalist. But I say he's an all-time journalist, but he refers to himself as sometimes a journalist. So was April last year, I was on Twitter, and I'm still getting used to Twitter because I joined late 2018, and I came across this article on Writers, and it was a story early in the pandemic of how the pandemic was hitting the homeless population in New York City, where I live. And I was like, oh, one of the people who was affected and one of the homeless people in the story happened to be fellow Nigerian born, and the person who was writing the story said he had ties to the country. And I was like, wait a minute, that name doesn't sound Nigerian, but could it be someone like me with a name that, when people see my names, they're like, oh, but you're not from Africa, or you're not Nigerian, you don't have a name, and they call me by Yoruba, they bring up a Yoruba name. So I had to look him up, and I was like, oh, I would like to have this person on my podcast and, find out who he is and hear his story. And, I just wrote it down and said, maybe one day I'll reach out. And then one day I realized that, wait, he has an Instagram. Maybe I should send a message. And, and one thing led to another. And here he is in the studio with me today. We're both vaccinated, so we can be in the studio. So I'm so happy to have Maurice Tamman in the studio with me today. And it's so inspiring, and I'm happy, and, I'm overjoyed. So thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So let's dive in, and let's begin from the very beginning. So where was Maurice's place of birth, and what was your childhood like?
I was born in London, and I spent the first few years in London. Of course, that means that I'm an Arsenal supporter, and
Oh my goodness!
yeah. I come by it honestly, of course.
I talk a lot of trash about Arsenal.
Well, it's easy this year. It hasn't always been easy, has it? So both my parents were born in Africa. My father was born in Sudan. His My grandmother was born in Alexandria in
Wow.
Egypt. So you know, they're North African Arab Jews. So
Oh.
they're true Africans. My
Yeah.
mother, on the other hand, is colonial English.
Wow.
She was born in they were living in Kenya at the time, and in a place called Karen, which is just outside Nairobi. Now it's a suburb of Nairobi. But they were on holiday, and she was born in Cape Town, I think. Uh, anyway, she was born in South Africa. Her sister was born in Dar es Salaam, actually. Anyway, in the early 60s, they were both in London, coincidentally. He's a short, swarthy North African fellow. My mother is a crazy, tanned, white English woman, and they had a torrid affair, and I came out, much to the chagrin of both families, as it turns out. um, and then in the early 70s, when Gowon was the president
Yeah.
in Nigeria, we moved to Kano in the north,
Wow.
where my father, we believe, ran a factory where they made lorries and trailers.
Yeah, there has to be vehicle factories in
Yeah,
northern Nigeria at one
right.
point in time. Yeah.
And those were the real formative years for me. Living on Kangal Road in Kanu, just down the road from the racetrack,
Hmm.
and the giant peanut pyramids that used to
Yeah.
build up, which was, for a pre-10-year-old boy, there was nothing more fun than to climb those peanut pyramids and get chased off by the dogs and the guards and such. And then in the late 70s, we moved back to the UK. Briefly, we lived in Cambridge, just outside Cambridge for a while. And then ultimately in 1979, my father's dream came true to move to the States. And in August of 1979, we
Hmm.
moved to the New York area.
Wow.
So, and then I, went to high school and,
Okay.
went downhill from there.
So you started in London, Kano. Oh, by the way, you're the second guest on this podcast who was born um, outside of Nigeria, but spent some time in Kano.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's also in New York here. Long Awe was born in Ghana
Hmm.
and schooled in Kano.
Is that right? Yeah.
Primary school in Kano.
Yeah, I went to primary school. There was two primary schools in Kano when I was there. There was the one for the expats, and there was one for the locals, and they were right next to one another. I forget the name of the street. But they were right. But every Friday afternoon, because school would end at noon because it was so hot and there was no air conditioning. But Friday afternoon, we would have a football match.
Oh.
And and there was no grass or anything, but
Yes, Kano.
um, but we would play, and of course, all the expats would show up in their football boots and their kits and their socks and their shin guards, and they would all look very pretty. And then the players from the school next door, which was for the locals, would come over, and we would lose 15-0 every week. And
Oh.
it was then I realized that the great untapped reservoir of footballers from Africa was just ready to be exploited. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think you saw since then, some great footballers come from West Africa in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just brought me up a video that popped up online yesterday. It was just I was making fun of the five-a-side soccer, and someone posted it in our dad's group because I help run a dad's group that will play every Friday, and it mentioned so he used the person who made the video. I think it was a black African in the UK who made the video, and he has the five people who you see at the five side. The first guy is the guy coming from the construction. He works in construction, always smokes, but he never gets tired when he's on the field. He never gets tired. And then I think the fourth person was the guy who has all the kids dressed to the nines. Every club, he has their outfits from head to toe. Doesn't have a single skill. It has no skill. I was like, yeah, I remember those days back.
Yeah. Well, I used to coach when my kids were younger. I had a son who played a lot of football, and so I coached him. And there was always an inverse relationship between the quality of the kid and the quality of the player.
Yeah.
If you had a parent who was hovering all the time and buying the best equipment for their child and sending them off to camps all the time, invariably this was a child who was often lacking. And I don't mean that to put the kids down. It's just that, football is a sport, I think, that you learn the most by playing with kids your own age and getting knocked down and getting up and playing and playing and playing. And, sometimes I think people can wish for their children, and that wish often manifests itself in buying things that they don't necessarily need.
True.
And I always felt I always had a soft spot for those kids because I knew that their expectations were not necessarily the same as their parents' expectations.
Yeah.
And they were coming out and playing and practicing for their parents as much as they were doing for themselves.
I think I once heard someone say something along the lines of lots of kids in sports are being made to fulfill the dreams their parents never couldn't fulfill. So it's like the parents push them to a certain limit that it's not necessarily the kid's dream, whereas the parents trying to relive that dream that they could never achieve.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, because my daughter loves kicking the ball at home. She sees me watching the game. My mom watches the game sometimes, and so we thought, maybe a good way for her to start socializing. She's going to be 3 in August. Was to get her signed up for one of the kids' soccer in the park, and we got her out there, and she looked from the stroller and said, "I want to go home." She was coming out. I said, "Okay, but can we watch them?" She said, "Nope."
Yeah.
So for the first 3 weeks, she said, "Nope." I didn't force her, but I just brought her there. Sometimes we watch. She would just sit down in the stroller, eat, drink. But when we get home, she's kicking the ball all the time. But when we get to the park, she sees other kids, and she knows 1 or 2 of them from the playground, and she's like, "Hi, but I'm not coming out to play with you." And then yesterday, she comes out, and she's just like, "I want to kick." She won't stop scoring. I was like, "Oh, I didn't think she was going to do that," but she's like, I'm ready now. I'm like, "Okay, well." And one of the parents with me, who's actually from the Caribbean, she was like, if they want to, they will. If they don't, you don't have to force them, because the moment you start, how old? She's not even up to 3. Wow, like you must go play. You must, I'm like, that's me trying to say, I wanted to be on the team. I wanted to. I'm like, nah. If you don't like it, fine. You go to other sports, or you go find your hobby somewhere else. Do your own thing. So, so that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So, with that being said, from your childhood, if I were to ask, for your favorite childhood memory, would that come from Kano, or would that come from somewhere else?
Almost certainly from Kano, I think. I mean, I lived a little Tom Sawyerish life while I was there. It was really, for a child, it was, I mean, compared to what life was like in dreary, cold London, it was like heaven. We had a horse, we had a monkey, we had 3 parrots, we had a swimming pool. I would jump on the horse anytime I wanted to and go down to the racetrack and race around the track that wasn't too far from the house. Yeah. My parents...
Oh, yeah, there has to be a race. Yeah, there was a race.
Yeah, I checked on Google. It's still there.
It's still there?
It's still there.
Wow.
I mean, whether they use it for racing, I don't know, but you can see the track.
I just recall seeing that in the news.
Yeah.
Papers. Yeah.
And I think because both my parents were Africans, or at least born in Africa, they didn't have the protective instincts that some of the Europeans, expats that were there. So I was given license to do whatever I wanted, and it just could go. And of course, school ended at noon.
Yeah.
So I was free for most of the day to go and do whatever I wanted. And it was, it was a wonderful place. And, and my mum was always mixing around town. She was very popular around the city, and she was well known. And because of that, I could go safely and do anything I wanted. Of course, it was a different time then, I suppose. But I loved Kano. It was a magical place for me.
So while you were there and mixing around, did you pick Hausa?
I could speak rudimentary Hausa when I was there. I have a funny story about that, actually. Now, of course, practicing Hausa after you've left
Yeah.
is nearly impossible, right? And of course, I had many other things on my mind once I became a teenager than maintaining my Hausa. But so I caught a cab from downtown. This is probably 3 years ago, maybe longer. And I needed to get to work. I think I had injured my ankle running or something, and so I couldn't take the subway. And so I took a cab from downtown up to Midtown. And I get in the cab, and I tell the cabbie where I'm going. And for whatever reason, I think I look like somebody who could be taken for a ride. And he's taking me all over Kingdom Come. And I'm like, where the fuck are you going, dude? And he goes, I'm taking you. I said, no, you're not taking me. And I could tell he had the ritual scars on his face. Right?
Ah, yeah.
Right. And so I knew where he was from. And so I cursed him out in Hausa because I could still remember how to curse in Hausa. And he starts laughing and laughing and laughing. And he said, wait. Hold on a second. And he pulled over the car on the side of the road, and he gets on the phone and he dials a number, and he says, holds up the phone, and he says, this is my wife. Tell her what you just told me. So I have to curse her out as well. So anyway, at that point, we drive straight to the office, right? And we get out, and, I don't know what the bill was. I can't remember now, but I've had a great time at that point. He and I have really had a lovely, 15 minutes together in the misery of Midtown traffic. And I go to pay him. He goes, no, this one's on me. This has been the best ride I've had in years. So my Hausa got me a free cab ride once.
Man, I can't remember any Hausa because I was born in Jos, and I used to speak Hausa as a kid, but unfortunately, family was more about English, so it got beat out of me. But when we moved to Benin City, there was a few people who could speak Hausa around me, but yeah, nobody. I wasn't around them,
Right.
so with time, it just disappeared. And I lost the ability to. And by the time I would move to Ibadan, where I was around a whole lot of Hausa people, it just seemed like I was always reaching, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
So other than Nagode, it's just, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
Or what's that, the other one, Rankadede. Yeah. So that's how I lost my Hausa. But I still, once you can connect with some taxi drivers, you can get you some.
Yeah.
You can get a free ride and some great
Yeah,
stories.
he was, it wasn't a small bill, I might add.
Oh,
it was a nice sized bill by the time we got there.
well, that's, I guess the ride around was worth it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, how long did you spend in London before moving to the United States?
So we came back, and 2.5 years we were in England. We actually moved up to Cambridge, just outside Cambridge. My father had a peculiar habit of choosing places where we could not have fit in any less. So we lived in a little village called Linton, and then another even smaller village called Castle Camps. And then in 1979, 2.5 years later, we moved to a small town up in northern New Jersey called Sparta. Very pretty place. Doesn't look like most of New Jersey, I must say.
But when you say your father chose places that he couldn't fit in, how did that work then?
I don't know. My father, I don't know about what your background is in terms of your immigration history. But for me, I've been an immigrant now in two countries, right? And I count England as an immigrant country, coming back from Nigeria to England. And we moved to this very, it was a very same place. All the students looked the same. All the students thought the same. I shouldn't say all, that's unfair. But there was a monolithic tendency. And, I was very tanned. I was very dark haired. I had black, almost, that bluish hair, very dark. And I was Jewish and all those things. And at that point, I hadn't given up my faith and become an atheist. But, we were practicing. And I, at that point, I thought we were the only Jews in town. And it was difficult. Once they found out that I was not Christian, I struggled sometimes to even make it home. That there would be boys, there was a couple of kids in particular who would be waiting for me at a certain bridge, and oftentimes it would result in fights.
Oh.
And I really struggled being, different. But my father was an assimilalist. He was a big believer. And of course, that generation of immigrants from all over the world, they wanted to be English, they wanted to be American, they wanted to be German, they wanted to be French. And they would, my father's first tongue is Arabic, and he never taught me Arabic as a matter of principle. He could speak French, English, Italian, Arabic, but he insisted we speak English because, I think that he wanted to belong. And my experience was, I don't want to belong. Yeah. If this is the way you treat people who are different from you, I have no interest in belonging. And it's funny how little things affect you. But that, for me, I always started to feel I don't want to belong if belonging requires me treating other people this way. And so I've always had this kind of outside view of the universe. I'm happy to step inside your world and enjoy your world and appreciate your culture, but I don't feel I belong anywhere. And as a result of that, I can appreciate you. I can appreciate the good in you and what you have to offer, but I don't belong to any particular group as a result of that. And, I think it's been borne out since I was a kid that, we can be a very unkind species to one another. And we see that all over the world every day.
Yeah. Yes. I think that's something that's common across, various immigrant communities. And even before I came over to the States, growing in Nigeria, it's part of why I lost the ability to speak Hausa, because as a kid, I remember being chastised I was able to grasp Hausa and Yoruba before the ages of 5. I was speaking Hausa and Yoruba all in Jos, because we had Yoruba kids in my compound, and Hausa kids and kids from other tribes too. But the Yoruba and Hausa were the closest to me, and somehow I just started picking up their language. But the complaint was that my English was not good enough. And that was why I was getting beatings and I was getting chastised, and I was always hearing family complaints. And somehow, I never heard anybody mention that our language, our mother tongue, which is Ijo, nobody ever mentioned that.
Right.
And then I'm a teenager, and one of my grand aunts visits from the village one day, and she always speaks in Ijo. And she's like, how old are you now? You still can't understand me, or I have to speak pidgin English to you every time. That's why I was like, well, why nobody ever tried to teach me? None of you speak to me. You're the only person who does. And she's asking everybody, and nobody's like, but then I started realizing that people in my house actually understand the language. And then later on, I found out that people understood like 3-4 languages. We have Ghanaian blood too, so there's a bunch of Tree, Fanti going on. And I was like, wait, but How come I was the only person? So but the English learning had gotten so into me that when I was in school, I became arrogant, or I bought into it so much that when I had the opportunity to learn French, I said, why do I need to learn French? I'm British. I belong to the British. So I refuse to take notes.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, beat me. I'll take the beatings.
Yeah.
So in school, I was getting beat because I didn't care
Yeah.
about learning French. I said, that's not a language nobody speaks. Only France speaks it. And then I started finding out that other African countries spoke French. I was like, actually, it was a job opportunity when I was around 18, 19. I was like, oh, no. And so I was like, wait, but it was that thing of we had to belong to English, but I was like, but we're in Nigeria, we're not even in England,
Right.
So why are we all fighting to be on the English side of things? And so I think that's even how at a very early age I stopped supporting England at the World Cup. And you couldn't find me in the English Premier League. I was just detaching because it's like when I started making those connections, like, wow, you all were beating English into me. I'm removing myself from England. I'm
Yeah.
removing myself from the English. And, so some people are like, oh, you hate England that much that you don't like English people. I said, no, I have English friends. I have English family because I have cousins who are born and raised in England. So am I going to hate them? No, it's not their fault. They didn't do anything to me. But that is just that the family thing of we had to belong to the extreme, and I saw how it was being used viciously on other people, and to this day they still don't realize how damaging that was because
Yeah.
we all can't speak our language. Only a few people can, and then it's like, but you are an embarrassment for not being able to speak language. But I'm like, who teaches language? Nobody.
Yeah.
But we all shout English. You must speak English.
Yeah.
Well, English, but
How difficult, if you don't mind me asking you some questions?
sure. It's a conversation. It's
yeah.
always.
So, growing up obviously in Nigeria, Nigeria is a country of so many tribes and languages. And I suppose, given the way the country was created and the borders were drawn, having some language that was common to everybody made sense, right?
Yep.
And I guess, you took, the colonial language was English, and so it made sense since the borders were drawn by the colonial powers to speak English. But it must be very frustrating as a Nigerian to know that, your colonial rulers are the ones that dictated the lingua franca, for want of a better word, of your country. And I'm wondering if that's a common feeling, or if you have it just to yourself, or.
Sometimes I understand I'm more understandable with having English as the language as one of the official languages, and where the problem arises for me is that growing up for a long time, it seemed like the Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo were like the big three. The big three.
Yep.
And it is just like stamped and said these are the official languages, but the way it's mapped out, it just seemed like no one else existed. And then later on, you're hit with, there's about 300 ethnic groups, and they all have their languages, and you're like, where are these people? And then if I wasn't from if I wasn't an Ijaw from Bayelsa, or I didn't stay in Benin City, I wouldn't have met a whole bunch of tribes in the south. But in the north, I just started blanketing everybody as Hausa. So luckily, I've had one of the people from the north on the podcast who's from a tribe that's not Hausa. But back then, it's one of the reasons why we're having this fighting going on now, where everybody's like, I don't like Hausa people. I don't like, but you just blanket everybody. No, they're all Muslims. It's easy to say that because of this idea that only 3 languages existed.
You're right.
And so it's easy to just gravitate to English, but there's no way of saying, yes, we can have 3 official languages, but that doesn't mean we should erase every other language that exists. There should be room for your language exists, but how about we have a way of unifying everybody by introducing each other's cultures and languages together. So it's just like these big 3, you take it or leave it. If you complain, you're against unity. So we have to stamp down on you hard, and then it's bam, bam. So we're all indoctrinated into this cult. That's how I see it, like a cult. And then one day it's like somebody snaps out of it. I'm like, wait a minute. I exist. Where's my existence in this fabric of unity? I don't see it.
Yeah.
And then you start questioning, and then they're like, why are you questioning? And then this person comes out and, wait, who are you? Your name. Why is someone with a name that sounds Malian? How are you Nigerian? Like, well, my tribe. What? You people exist in Nigeria? Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Have you been to this part of the country? No. But I thought you all Hausa there. We are not Hausas. There's no Hausa even there. Like, what? But all the maps we've seen said house. No. And then it's like, but so we don't know. It's just from the colonial days, they just gave Hausa to one whole region.
Yeah.
And everybody just goes with it. And
Well, there was a recognition, I think, from the early days of Nigeria, that was always going to be a struggle. I mean, wasn't that the metaphor of the Nigerian knot, right? That was supposed to tie everybody together of all different ethnicities and cultures and stuff. I mean, I think there's been mixed success since independence, but
I don't know. I don't believe the foundation was ever right. It was never a solid foundation. And to me, like, I don't personally believe in Nigeria as a country. That we have I was talking to a good friend of mine. We both grew up in Port Harcourt. We're in Port Harcourt. I mean, we stayed in Port Harcourt at around the same time. He's in London now. And he brought up a point that the southern Cameroons, the Amazonian region that's trying to break out of Cameroons, have I ever noticed that their food and most of our food are similar? That we have so much in common with those people than we do with other parts of the country. And I was like, yeah, it's true. Because I met Cameroonians when I was stationed in Bahrain. And they brought one of their stews to me, and I was like, oh, this is so familiar. I was trying, like, I've eaten this before. This looks like food I've eaten somewhere. And they're like, oh, yes, you guys call it Edikan Kong, but we call it Eru.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow. And he was like, I told you. But it's like, so if we were the ones creating a country by ourselves, I don't think we would have created a country with the northern Nigeria. We probably wouldn't. Or maybe if we had, it would have been a different deal. But this deal that Britain used was more of, we give power to a certain clique, and it's just these three tribes. And we still don't know the exact number because the census is always bent towards favoring the big three. And out of the big three is technically two, because the Igbos have always been marginalized for like forever. And it just becomes so lopsided. And the moment you start digging into it, there's always like holes and gaps and holes and gaps. And you're like, yeah. Then people start going, why are we even one country? Why are we one country? It doesn't make sense. So they have to it's either they have a restructuring, or I hate to say it, but restructuring, civil war, or I don't know if there can be a peaceful breakup, but that's one of those three things that just has to happen.
Yeah.
So that's the way I see it. But it's part of the cracks that started happening a while back. And every time I meet my tribesmen, I attend meetings, and I'm sitting down looking at the views, the opinions being given, and it's still like, yeah, but we belong to this union. We need to. And I'm like, how? It's still going by the same old things that we've been suffering. So how is it going to be different this time? Oh, we'll get power one way or the other. What is the one way or the other? It's still the same thing. So are we going to be recognized? We're not recognized. We're lucky to get a president, and we saw how the attacks were so vicious against him. Like, people weren't happy that a guy who his disqualification was that he was a minority. But is he qualified to be president? He was the first president who was like non-military, a professor, had a background in education, but there were people who were angry about saying you have to be military and you have to. And it's like, but how many of us are in those places?
Yeah.
So I'm just like, nah, it's not working. So they have to go back to the drawing board. We can't rely on what Britain used to set up a country that the people who set it up had never even been there.
Yeah.
To create, they were all countries, and then you join them together to form one nation.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me. But we'll see. Hopefully, it can be a peaceful resolution. But I'm not optimistic about that.
Yeah, from your lips.
Yeah. But back to your story. It's
Okay.
more interesting than my views.
All
So, when did you, with all that had happened to you, with all that you had experienced, when did you start to, be inspired to take the steps or, embrace the journalism? Like, I know it wasn't, let me not say I'm not going into university yet, but, or maybe closer to university, but when did that, when will you say the, I won't say epiphany, but like the lights, or the path, when did the path start to open up for you? Like maybe this was something that was calling to you?
So I had been in the States. I was a sophomore in high school, so it was my second year over here. And I'm not going to pretend that I was a particularly good student because I wasn't. I tended to have two grades, A and D, and somehow in the middle was my grade point average. But if it involved writing, I usually did fine. If it involved anything else, I didn't.
That sounds like me.
And
So I used to
so,
like writing.
yeah. So in my sophomore year, I had a teacher who took one of my essays um, and it was an essay on wearing razor blades as jewelry, and I can't remember much else about it, but she was really impressed with it and encouraged me at that point. Now, when did I decide I wanted to become a journalist? I think almost from that moment forward, it was somehow in the back of my mind that that's what I would want to do. Now, I was motivated by many things at that time, not necessarily education. So I went to college. I ended up dropping out. And I took a number of jobs, including in sales, and I had a kid at home at that point, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wasn't happy, and I walked into a small newspaper in southern New Jersey, and there was just outside Camden, across the river from Philadelphia. And I said, I'd like to become a reporter or a journalist. And rather than laugh at me, the woman said, well, if you can go up to Willingboro, New Jersey, and write a story about this evening's school board meeting, you can start work as a stringer right now. And the stringer is a freelancer.
Oh,
And
stringer.
and so I don't even know if, I think it's an anachronistic term these days. I don't know if anyone uses it, but that's what they called it back then. This was 1991. And basically, within a few months, I was what they called a full-time stringer, which is basically a freelancer with no benefits. And within the year, I was a full-time staffer, and that was it. It would be almost impossible for anyone to break through into the business nowadays.
Yeah.
That way. But back then, some people got lucky.
Wow.
So that's how it happened.
When you mentioned school board meeting, I was like, man, there have been a lot of school board meetings that have gone viral lately.
Yeah. Well, Willingboro back in the day would have been one of those if they had been broadcast that way. They were volatile meetings. Of course, they were wrestling with a lot of the socioeconomic issues that we face today. Immigrant populations moving into town, established white communities resenting it, not wanting to accommodate. It was at the beginning of the cusp of some of those issues that we're facing today in many ways. And so, my ambition was not to cover school board meetings, but if I had paused for a second and thought about it, I would have realized that these were the individual stories and the local conflicts that we continue to face today.
So I'd like to continue, but before we do that, I'd like to take a quick break and we'll be right back shortly. Hi everyone, your host Raphael Harry here. I can't believe we've gone past our 1 year anniversary of doing White Label American. I've had the privilege of speaking with some amazing people, sharing their modern day immigrant stories. And you've allowed this Nigerian immigrant to share parts of his immigrant journey through this podcast. Also, one of my goals of this podcast is breaking down artificial walls that keep people from getting to understand each other. Based on your wonderful feedback over the last year, I think we have done a decent job in breaking down some of those walls. We would like to continue and expand on this mission, but we need your help. I've had an amazing time creating and producing episodes for this show largely on my own. We have a lot of ideas for new and exciting content to expand upon the mission, but we need direct support from you, our listeners, which is why we have created a White Label American Patreon page where you can make a one-time donation or become a sustaining contributor where you can get access to exclusive content, help me interview upcoming guests by submitting questions, and even have the chance to sit down with me for a one-on-one conversation, either virtually or in studio. So if this podcast means something to you, and if you really love this show, think about becoming a sustaining contributor and donating by going to patreon.com/whitelabelamericans.pod. Thanks for listening and for the privilege of your company. So welcome back and thank you for joining us, and we shall continue in the world of journalism. Oh, before we continue with journalism, we had touched on your return. So let me go back a little bit. When you returned back to the UK, you had mentioned, your dad picking an area that you guys weren't accepted. From the sound of things, did he do the same in New Jersey?
Yeah, exactly the same thing. Now, I will say that I found at that time the U.S. to be a liberating place. That I didn't have the same issues that I faced when I moved to the UK. But it was still odd. I mean, we moved. My father bought this big house on an acre of land in a town where we clearly were the only ones, or at least one of a very small handful of Jewish families. And I think because my mother was not Jewish, she converted for him. I think to some extent he did this for her, right? He bought houses and places that he thought would make her happy. We could talk, or my shrink and I have discussed my father and my mother many times, but in this case, I think that this was a gesture always to her, because she was, even though she was born in Kenya, she was of English stock, and she was raised by a very English mother, and so she had those sensibilities and the pastoral life and all that, the rose gardens and that was part of her, and I think he was attempting to please her. He dragged her all over the world, and yet he chose places that he thought would make her feel more comfortable and happy. Whether he succeeded, I don't know. I mean, that first generation of immigrants, and I don't really count myself in that group, but my father, they have dreams about what it means to be an immigrant.
Yes.
And they want they're doing it to improve their lives,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's to escape from persecution or to find a better living or whatever it is. Immigrants are doing it because they want to uplift themselves and their families, right? They believe that choice they're making, whether forced or otherwise, if maybe it's not a choice, but that movement from one place to another is for the betterment of their families. And I know that my father did that, but I will say that I also don't think he ever found peace in any of the countries he lived in. That he was always, as much as I was an outsider, he was an outsider 10 times more. He did. I learned the cultural tics that allow you to move freely in my new country. Whether it's what type of shoes to wear or what type of socks to wear, or the jewelry that's okay, or the trousers that you should wear, or the music. My father never connected at that level culturally. And so he was always a foreigner. And he would try desperately to fit in, and he would desperately fail every time. And so once he left Khartoum, I'm not sure that he ever found peace again. And it's really kind of sad, because he struggled so hard. Sometimes he had success, sometimes he didn't. But it was this endless swinging back and forth of not being able to succeed. And, I have a lot of sympathy for him. We didn't get along very well. But I do sympathize for his struggles and the difficulties. And I don't think it's unique. I think that almost every adult immigrant faces those issues in to one degree or another.
I agree with that. I agree with that assessment because my mom falls into that category, and she, when she told me she was going back to Nigeria after being here for 3 decades, and it was kind of like a last minute. I think it was at the very last minute she told me that she was going back, and by then I'm not. It's not like I would have stopped her from going, but I was just worried about her health and the security situation in where she chose to go to. But I understood that because when she finally decided to leave Nigeria and move over here, if I had been in the position to advise her then, I don't think I would have told her to go. I would have told her to stay, knowing her personality.
Yeah.
I would have said, stay. You're better off in Nigeria. Things were not that bad for you. Things were actually on the upside for her. But whoever advised her said, oh, it's better for you to go. And she just couldn't restart life. And it was a struggle, and, it just didn't work out. And seeing that by the time I arrived and I saw it, it was because you're getting a different picture when you're not there. You're talking to her on the phone. You're getting letters. It's a different picture. And then when I finally arrived, I was like, oh wow, this is not what I was being told, and now I'm seeing a totally different thing. And it's like this. I know this person, and even though we have our issues, we have our disagreements, it doesn't mean I don't wish you well, or I don't want you to have peace or have to enjoy yourself. I know the environments you thrive in. The United States at that point in time wasn't where she was going to thrive in. Even if she had moved to another country, it wasn't. The only place I could see her thriving in was like Ghana. That was the closest. So the only option was for her to go back.
Yeah.
And now that she's back home, you can see the difference. You can see that she's back where she knows financially it's not viable because she waited a little bit. She waited too long to go back. But other than that, but psychologically, emotionally, she's still practicing on the religious side. I'm also not religious. I'm an atheist too, and she's thriving in all that. It's what she wants, and I'm like, yeah, that's what she needed,
Yeah.
because she doesn't have to fight anymore to belong. Because by the time she moved here, she made her final choice, her final, because she had been coming to the States and go back. She had been coming, go back, and then she said, okay, I'm going to migrate finally. She was in she was almost 60.
Yeah.
And it was like, who are the people that advised you to start life all over again? And yeah, it was a struggle, because the fights that she had with my elder brother, I understood that, and I could see I could see why it was happening. Not that I'm taking anybody's side, but I could see why it was happening, because when people will be like, oh, because she wants to try to adjust, but people are like, but you're this age, you shouldn't. This is not for you, and you're too old. But she's like, I can adjust, I can adjust. Like, yeah, but we'll see your age, kind of thing. So, I understand from that point of view, and because there's some people who are like, oh, but your mom did this to you, your mom did that. Why I would have written. I won't talk to her anymore. I'm like, I don't necessarily need to talk to her, but I don't hate her, because I can see the humanity in her struggles. I can see in her mistakes. I can see the human being making the mistakes there. So I empathize with that person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that I don't have time to be of hate on all that. And whatever her mistakes are, that's for her to deal with. But I think that's part of my therapy, also speaking there too. So. Yeah, but it's something that I understand for immigrants. It took me a little bit to get to that stage to start seeing it that, wow, when immigrants move from one place to another and begin life all over. I think that's another thing that I noticed while I was in the military. I think I began to notice it when I was in the military, because when you move from one duty station to another, and it's like you start all over there. And I think I met a woman who was actually, she was from Australia, and she married service. I think her husband was in the Navy or Army. I can't recall which one. And she talked about meeting the guy over 20 years ago, and he was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna serve for like 2 years, and then I'll be out." And then it's 20 years later, I'm here, and I don't have a career and all this. And like, so you got to restart your life everywhere, because she can't keep a job, because she has to live her life according to the man's career. And I was like, yeah, this is not gonna be me. I can't do that. So there's that part of the struggle, and you look at all that, you're like, wow, So I empathize with decisions a whole lot of people make, and the journey of a whole lot of immigrants, and I understand. I see the humanity there, and it's not easy to make that adaptation, and I understand those who say, that's it, I'm done, I'm going back.
Yeah. It's two things. I mean, it's language, obviously, but it's more than that. It's the language, the cultural language as well.
Yes.
And I think actually in some ways that's a much harder thing to learn.
It is much harder.
It's why children come and adapt so quickly, is because they're fungible, and
the sponge.
Yeah, and so they see it and they pick up on it, and it's subconscious. Whereas adults, we're kind of ossified, and it takes time for us to pick up on. And some of those cues we never pick up on, even if we understand and speak the language perfectly. It's really very difficult, and I think it takes a lot of effort to learn that way. And I have huge sympathy for immigrants, and do whatever I can to support them in any way I can.
That's right. So, one big part of your journalism is reporting on climate change. So, why is that so important to you?
Well, most of my career, I didn't cover climate change. My last two projects. Let me just explain a little bit about my job, because it'll give some context here. So for most of the last 15, 20 years, I have worked in positions where I do project work, which means to say that I spend a fair amount of time on stories, investigating, doing data analysis, reporting, writing. I don't write every day. In fact, I don't write every month. And over the course of my career, I've done big stories on banking. I've done big stories on healthcare and Medicare. I've done big stories on crime and punishment and people who are wrongly convicted. And, I don't like to be reporting and writing on the same subject for an extremely long period of time. This has probably been the longest period I have stayed on the same subject, in part because I think it's a particularly important subject, not just for regionally, but globally. So I guess my last project before the most recent one was I had talked to some people who had suggested that there was evidence that fisheries around the world were migrating north as the oceans were warming up. So how do you gauge that? I mean, fish swim everywhere, right?
Yes.
It's not like us who, when we move, we have to get a moving van and load it up and move. Fish just go wherever the water is suitable for them and they can eat enough food.
Yes.
And so that project evolved into something called Ocean Shock, which was a description of how the oceans themselves are being impacted by climate change. That was my first venture into science reporting. It was my first attempt at climate change reporting. It was really well received. And my boss asked me to continue, which led to the most recent project, which was an examination of who, basically it was 6 profiles, in-depth profiles of some of the most influential climate scientists in the world. And when I say in-depth, I spent months over time, months with all of them on holiday, at work, researching. I can't tell you how many. Once the pandemic hit, how much time I spent on Skype and Teams and Zoom and such, talking with these folks. But the idea was that we wanted to tell the story of the scientists, not just the science. To give a context. Why are these people doing what they're doing? What motivates them when it seems so dire and the prospects of finding a solution so unlikely? Why do they continue? And they were all incredibly optimistic that ultimately we will find a solution to our man-made problem of climate change. So whether I do another climate change story remains to be seen, but maybe.
Well, I'm happy that they're optimistic, because man, it's tough when it comes to climate change. Because was it 2019 or 2018? I think it was 2018. I still had my former podcast partner. Yeah, it was 2018. So New York Magazine had a climate change event at New York Times, and the other gentleman who I said school in Kano, he's the co-founder of the New York, it's still the New York Supply Chain Meetup, and it's expanded to the Worldwide Supply Chain Meetup.
Mm-hmm.
So they used to meet on, they started from just a meetup group, and now it's like a big group of people into supply chain around the world, and it's sustainable business is one of the big topics, and climate change also gets to be discussed there. And he just posted this event like, hey, they're going. This is something that affects us being supply professionals, because I used to handle supply chain in the military.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, go check it out. And I went there, and man, there was all I've forgotten his name, the gentleman who was the first person. He's credited with being the first person to report on climate change, address Congress on climate change. This was way over 30 years ago. And when he first brought it up, he was talking about how there was bipartisan support. It was like the golden age, and it just seemed like a different universe he was talking about
Yeah.
back then, and I was like, wait, what? All this was happening, and it just seemed like everything could have been solved back, and then it started changing all of a sudden, and one of the most it was at that event that I began to realize that even as a kid in Nigeria, they had been talking about climate change without saying climate change because one of the languages that one word that picked up pretty early was desertification. And almost every regime, because I grew up under the military, every military administration always talked about allocating funds to fight against the desertification of some northern states. The Sahara Desert is encroaching, and I was like, "Well, Sahara Desert, what?" And and that was also what led to one of the bias that I had, my removal of one of the bias that I had because we used to always assume that all northerners were dressed modestly, like covering their bodies because of Sharia law. And then it was later I found out that due to the wind blowing sands, that you need to cover your body, otherwise you can get paralyzed from the sands hitting you.
Yeah.
So excuse me, it's not a matter of I have a choice. Or I want to. You expose your body. Yeah, you just damaging yourself. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can't be in the south. It's different, but up there, and then I started hearing about pollutions in my part of the country, and then I read a magazine once, and they were talking about acid rain, and I was like, wait, what? Acid rain? And then they mentioned Niger Delta. I was like, what? You mean I've been in acid rain all this time? Wait, what? But then I still didn't know it was climate change. I didn't realize all that was added into the climate change until, and it was at this conference that when they started presenting pictures of different parts of the world, and they showed some parts of, they showed a village in Mali. It was a village in Mali from the 60s, and they showed the desert, the Sahara Desert. And then they showed in that same village in 2015, the desert was literally over the village. And I was like, wow, this is what they talk about in northern Nigeria, what they've been trying to prevent. Well, as kids, we've been hearing this stuff, but I can assure you, all the people in my generation who heard that fighting desertification, it still doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to their brain when we've been fighting climate change, or we've been trying to. It doesn't add up when you talk to them today that this is what they've been trying to do then, because we just saw it as something that was used to steal funds. It was just corruption. So these people.
Well, I mean, it's a bit like the frog in the boiling water, isn't it? I mean, you put the frog in the water when the water's cool, and you turn on the stove, and the frog never realizes it's cooking.
Exactly.
And so, you grow up, and every year it gets incrementally warmer and drier, or whatever the circumstances are. It's really difficult as humans, because of the way, our lifespan, to really appreciate how things have fundamentally changed. It takes pictures, as you suggested, to really illustrate what's going on, whether it's satellite images of lakes in Iran, for example, or it's villages that have been overrun by sand from the desert.
Even Lake Chad.
Yeah.
I was at an event also with my people from Niger Delta, and there was this big argument about all the terrorist groups and all the others, and I was like, you don't realize that since Lake Chad started drying up, insecurity started increasing. So it's another reason why when the Pentagon released that report in 2015 or 2016 about the biggest threats to security being climate change, I agreed. I was like, yes, it's climate change, because I've not seen a single place that's affected by climate change where you have security, where security is stable in the world. It's not, but I think that's something. But people frowned at me at the conference when I said that, because it wasn't what they were expecting, because I think they were expecting me to attack the religion that wasn't the dominant religion in our part of the country, and I was like, no, it's because we also, as soon as the rains have been increasing in our part, because we have the rivers, and as soon as the rains increase, what happens? We're all flooded. And I was like, in our records, what happened? Do we have records of this amount of rainfall? Why are we getting so much flooding now? Everybody's
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why the term global warming has kind of fallen out of favor. I mean, as a
yeah.
practical matter, yes, the planet is getting warmer, but that has different effects in different parts of the world. Certainly if you were to look at the northern and southern extremes of the planet, you're going to see warmer. You're going to see what the warm is doing. There's less ice, there's less permafrost, all those kinds of things. But in some places of the world, there's more rain.
Yeah.
In other places of the world, on the coastal areas, you get more flooding because the sea levels are rising. In other places, it's dry. In the interior of some continents, you're going to get more dry weather. So it manifests itself in different ways. The weather is going to become more volatile. The ocean currents are going to stop moving as quickly, and all of those have knock-on effects that scientists probably. Many scientists can reasonably predict what's going to happen, some of which have already started to come to be. But it's tough, if I look up and it's raining every day, some parts of the world are actually cooler. If you look at a map of the planet, for example, and look at the mean, the temperature anomalies, that is, that it's below or above some type of average over the course of time, you will see a spot south on the ocean south of Greenland that is cooler, and the rest of the world is hotter. My understanding is that part of that is that there's a lot of runoff from the glaciers from Greenland, which is putting fresh water into the oceans, which is cooler than the ocean itself. That water sits on the surface and is cooling the water. Now, you would think because it's cooler, that would be refuting the fact there's climate change and global warming, when in fact what you have is an effect from one part affecting another part that illustrates why that it's more than just warming. It's climate chaos at times. It's things happening in ways that have not happened for a very long period of time, and very quickly and counterintuitively sometimes.
So, do you ever get feedback to your stories when you put out your projects? When you put out projects, so like climate change, with the way it's been so politicized over, especially in America. Since you put out this project, have people been like, "Oh, you're trying to put this agenda? You're trying to sell it up"? Do people ever?
You always
back to
get
you?
some of that, but honestly, in the last one, it was minimal.
Okay.
And if you read the stories, I think they're balanced and fair. I don't try to pretend that climate change is not real, because it clearly is. But there are reasonable people can disagree on what to do about it. Reasonable people can disagree on the extent that the future will change within a range of possibilities. What isn't reasonable, in my opinion, is to assume that the planet is somehow just going through a natural cycle, because there is virtually no evidence of that.
Oh yeah. Yep, I have lost someone because of that. Anytime I post the climate change story, it's like, hey, it's just one of those things, man. Stop worrying about that.
Well,
I don't get
it's
it.
not. I don't worry about me. I worry about my children and my children's
Exactly.
children, and your children and your children's children, and what kind of world are they going to live in?
Yeah.
Think about your relatives in Nigeria. I read somewhere someone suggested, as long as you live on a parallel line north of Paris to Munich or Berlin or whatever it was, that you're going to be fine. In other words,
Wow.
the planet is going to be eminently livable in the northern and southern, far northern and far southern hemispheres. But below there, you're going to face issues, and there's some truth to that. The climate. What are you going to do when you can't grow crops anymore and feed your population?
Below that line, isn't that like the majority of the population?
Probably. I don't know where the line really is, but the point though is that there's a huge swath of the planet
Yep.
that is going to become increasingly difficult to live, and that's going to result in migrations. Some of it is not going to be welcome. We only have to look to Europe to see what's happened in response to the migrations, migrants coming from North Africa and from Syria. To know that, people don't necessarily welcome foreigners stepping into their country and asking for help, and that can only get worse as climate change gets worse.
Wow. That's true. True all the way. But yeah, that's my main reason for worrying about climate change is not really for me; it's for the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, in covering this project, and well, I'll postpone this question because you do your journalism, but there's still other things that you do. And let me see. So, which one should I go with first? All right. So, you also, like you said, you don't do a lot of writings for your projects nowadays, but there's something that you do a lot of writing on, which you've put out there. So, but it's not in a traditional form yet, but it's on your website.
Mm-hmm.
So, do we call it an ebook without calling it an ebook?
You know what it is? It's a hobby, and I once had early in my career as a journalist, I was told by an editor who I have the most respect for, that a writer writes to be read, and if you want to call yourself a writer, and you don't let anyone read it, that's like masturbation, right? It's like, it's okay and it's fun, but there's a greater purpose to life than masturbation. So I had been working on this idea for some time, and decided it's not finished. The pandemic was going on. I didn't know when I was going to finish it. And I thought, well, let me just put it out there and see, without any expectations or anything. It was sitting there on my computer. And I decided to just put it on and see if anyone read it. A few people did. I don't know if it's very good, but, to the extent that I like to call myself a writer, I felt that this was an experiment that I could just do, and that's what I did. Just put it out there.
I think you're a writer. I see you as a writer. I enjoyed reading it. I haven't read it all the way, but I have to, and it actually encouraged me. I was like, because I have stuff that I've written down. I'm like, but now I realize that mine is it's more like my masturbation now. So I'm encouraged now to share mine.
Yeah.
As soon as you said that, I was like, wow, that's me. My wife's gonna laugh at this one now.
Yeah.
And I have a good friend who's my former English professor, and he's always like, put it out there, man. Put it out. Just write, put it out there. And I was like, I don't know. Don't worry, I'll get to it. And then I'll write like 5 paragraphs, and then I'm like, no. I don't like the ending.
Mm-hmm.
I want to change something. I'll come back to it, and then 2 years have passed.
Yeah.
So you're also a sailor,
Mm-hmm.
and how did you come about that?
So we visited when I was a kid. There was a Lebanese family that we had known that my father had known when he was a kid in Khartoum, and some of those relatives also lived in Kano. And that family invited us to spend a summer with them in upstate New York, in a little town called Gloversville, and um, this was 1976. It was the bicentennial year, and so we spent a summer in Gloversville, and there was a day camp, such an American concept, but
Yeah, so it was a day camp.
yeah. So we would go to this camp every day in the summertime, and I had never experienced anything like this, but they had a little sunfish there, and that's where I first sailed. And the moment I got on that, I thought it was the coolest thing that you could just sit on a boat with a piece of, because obviously, I mean, I grew up in Kano, and there's no water in Kano. There's no lakes. I mean, there was a dam we used to visit every now and then, but we couldn't touch the water because we'd get bilharzia, so we couldn't go swimming or anything. I mean, water is dangerous. Standing water in Africa is dangerous. You got to be careful, right? But here in Gloversville, New York, there was this little sailboat, and I could go out by myself, and the wind would push me along, and I could steer it, and I thought that was pretty magical. And that was how I got turned on to sailing. And, episodically over the next few years, I would find my way onto a boat and go again. But, then I started raising a family, and, I gave up all things that weren't related to making money and raising a family. And I guess about 20 years ago now, 20, maybe even a little longer back, I said, I'm in a position now, I can afford to buy a boat and start sailing more regularly. And I've been doing it ever since. I've been living on my boat now since 2009. The winter of 2009. Now, this winter, I'm not on the boat because I was getting some repairs done. But for most of the last 12 years, I have been living on the boat in the New York area.
And the name of your boat?
Zenora.
How did that come about?
Well, first, before I get to that, let me tell you a story about that. So, this was a big boat for me. I mean, it was a 53-foot boat, and I was, I wanted something bigger, something that could take me further. And I was on a 36-foot boat at the time, and I was looking around, and I couldn't decide, do I really want to do this? It was a big decision. I had pretty much decided against it. And a friend of mine from Florida, because the boat was in Florida at the time, I'd gone down, I had looked at the boat, I was really hemming and hawing about what to do. And, as some people want to do, I sat down with a bottle of rum and I started to figure out whether I wanted to do this. And I got an email or a text message, I don't remember now, from a friend of mine, an old sailor mate from Florida. And in it, he had a link to Harry Belafonte's song, Jump in the Line, right? And if you recall that song, Jump in the Line, he says, hey, senora, right? But he doesn't pronounce it like senora. His Spanish is a little crooked, and he says, hey, Zenora, right? If you listen to this, well, at least it sounded that way to me after a few shots of rum. And so I played it over and over again until the bottle was done and I was thoroughly wasted. And I decided if there's a song, if my boat already has a song for her, then clearly I should own this boat. And that's how I made the decision to buy her, over that bottle of rum and listening to Harry Belafonte about 20 times that night, singing Hey Zenora in his terrible Spanish. Anyway, so the name itself comes from the previous owner. So they're from the Cornwall area of England. The boat they used to sail it around the Caribbean and go back home to Cornwall. And So they are long-time sailors. They were older now, and they came from a village called Zenor, excuse me, Zenor. And there's a legend in Zenor that there was a priest who worked at this church that had a wonderful choir, and it was right on just above the rocks on the ocean. And the choir was so good that the mermaids would come down, and they would climb out of the water and sit on the rocks and listen to the choir sing. And one day the priest goes down to talk to them, and he was never heard of again.
Oh, wow.
He had fallen in love with one of the mermaids and disappeared into the ocean, and so they named their first boat the Maid of Zenor, excuse me. And Zenor, yeah. And so their second boat they bought, they wanted to keep the same theme going, but this was a really fast boat, so they called her the Witch of Zenor, or Zenor.
Zenor.
Yeah. And so their third boat, that boat was too big for them. They decided they needed to make it a little smaller, believe it or not. They came down to my boat, but they wanted to keep the name going. And so in the village, a diminutive name for girls is Zenora. And so they decided, since they were going to a smaller boat, Zenora would be a good name. Now, changing the name of a boat is fraught if you have any superstitions whatsoever. And you'll forgive me, as an atheist, I should be above these things.
Yeah.
But I'm probably the most superstitious person you'll ever meet. And in order to change the name of a boat, it requires, there are all kinds of rituals that people suggest, everything from toasting the various gods of the depths to there are some traditions that say you have to have a virgin urinate on the bow of the boat.
Oh, my goodness.
Right? Well, I couldn't find a virgin, so I decided that, no, I'm not going to change the name. And I love the story about the mermaids. And
I love that story, too.
so I said, I'm not going to change. And I've never actually, the boat before that I didn't change. That boat's name was Calliope. Or Calliope. Calliope was one of the muse of epic poetry, right? From the Greek tradition of mythology. So, as a writer, I thought the idea of having a boat named after a muse and a poet seemed appropriate to me. So I kept it. And in the case of Zenora, of course, these are simply rationalizations, so I don't have to deal with the superstitious issues that I was clearly going to face if I was going to change the name.
You know what? I've come up with a new theory. Being that you grew up, you had a good number of years in Kano, and then you ended up being a sailor, believing the aquatic superstitions. I think you're an Ijaw man. You just didn't know it. Yeah, you're an Ijaw man because you take to water, you take to sailing. Yeah, and the mermaid, as soon as you brought that mermaid story, I was like, yep, that's an Ijaw man right there. That's too many mermaid stories I've heard about from being with when I go by Gogoro for the Ijaw people. I'm in an Ijaw village. I just go into the little shanties and shots for all the uncles and the papas here, and they're like, man, come see that. Let me tell you something. When I was fishing 20 years ago, there was this mermaid I saw. Like, man, who else saw this mermaid with you? I was the only one on the river, like 2 a.m. in the morning. I was like, well, give him another shot.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So yeah, we've adopted you as an Ijaw man now.
Thank you very much. I'm honored, really.
So to start, before I'm getting ready to wrap up, but I got to ask some fun questions.
Okay.
Final questions. So this will be the final 2 questions, there'll be 3 questions. But first one will be food. Where would you say your heart belongs to when it comes to favorite food or favorite cuisine?
Almost Middle Eastern food. for sure. I mean, there is a dish that my grandmother made called mulachia, and it is jute leaves, jute leaves, sometimes called Jew's marrow, but it's the peasant food of much of the Middle East, from Lebanon, Egypt, parts of that part of the world.
Yeah.
And my grandmother taught me how to cook it, and I cooked it for all my children,
Nice.
and they're constantly asking me to cook it for them.
Oh, great.
And I continue to cook it in great quantities in the winter too, and then I freeze it. But in the summertime, not so much. But yeah, for sure, I think that's where my food now a little sere, that stuff, those beef sticks they would put around the fires with the hot peanut. In Kano, they used to have this dish where you'd have a fire pit.
Oh, like suya.
Yeah, is that how you say it?
Suya, yeah.
Suya, and it's a peanut chili powder they put on the beef, and they put it around the fire. I have on occasion made that. That's delicious too. So that's my favorite dish.
Did you do the flat meat or you?
Yeah, the flat meat.
Okay, the flat meat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't had the flat meat in ages.
Yeah.
Okay, music. So, 3 favorite artists from each place you've called home, or?
Oh, well, that's going to be tough, but
Or you can just go with New York.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's so Elvis Costello. From my youth in the UK, I mean, I guess I evolved from the Sex Pistols and Pill to more sophisticated new wave music, and Elvis has always had a special place in my heart. So he would be on my list. Puccini. In my early 20s, I fell in love with Italian opera. And I continue to love Italian opera, even though I don't understand a single word of Italian other than basta. But there's something about the language itself that's so emotive, and and it's an interesting language too, because we talked about this, about Nigeria not having a one language. Well, Italy didn't have one language for a long time. There were dialect. Every region had its own dialect, and some of them were very different from one another. And it wasn't until unification, which was not that long ago, I wish I had the dates in front of me, where they started to come up with a unified idea of what the language was. But anyway, that's an aside. I love Italian opera, and in particular, I love
Italian opera too.
Puccini. And I'm not going to say a third one, but I was on my phone the other day, and I was trying to pick what music I was going to listen to when I went for my run, and I got the suggestion, your music from 2020, which is what I've played on this app for all of 2020, the best of. And I came to realize that I have stopped listening to pop music, and I'm listening to classical music and folk music. And my taste in music has somehow shifted over the years now, where I find myself listening to music that's like older than I am. Much older than I am, sometimes hundreds of years older than I am. And I'm not sure what that says about me, except that it's changed. So, anyway, that's my 3.
What you said about Italy reminded me of the Italian, my friend whose wife is from Molfetta. And when she was breaking down Italian dialects and the differences, and I was like, we need to do an episode just on this.
Well, I mean, and we could talk about the difference between talking in London and talking in Glasgow, for example. There's a big difference on the British Isles as well.
I need to get I'm trying to do an episode with my English, my English cousin and my Scottish cousins, because I have cousins in Edinburgh.
That would be really wonderful, because
but they're on 2 different wavelengths, so they don't I don't even know if they see eye to eye, but
Okay.
that would be fun.
Well, it's okay because they could argue with one another and nobody would understand really. It would just be entertaining to listen to the different voices.
I'll be here like, yes, I'm the host.
Yeah.
And I was born in Nigeria. And
Yeah.
I'm New York.
And then you could just simply translate for everybody and make it easier for them.
That's a good idea. I'll still try to put it to work. All right. So thank you for giving me your time.
Thank you.
And final question that I like to give every guest is, what would you like to leave the audience with? Could be, a word from, it could be a sentence from a book you've read, could be from one of your projects, could be from one of your favorite songs, could be anything. You're freestyling, so it's just you.
So, we talked about Elvis Costello.
Yeah.
And on his first album, My Aim Is True. And comes from the song Allison. And I have always held those 4 words close to me. That, we may fail. In fact, we often fail.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe arguably we fail more often than we succeed.
True.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing. I agree.
But what's wrong is if your aim is not true. That my aim is true. What I achieve, attempt to achieve is true. I may miss my target sometimes, but my aim is to achieve something positive and decent. And I think that, it served me well.
I love that. I love that. So, as my people say, Mbana, again, for coming on the podcast. And if people want to reach out to you, where can they do that, or how can they do that?
I'm on Twitter, Instagram. Actually, Twitter better because I tend to keep my Instagram private. But yeah,
Right.
Twitter is the best way to find.
Okay. So I'll put the Twitter link
Mm-hmm.
in the show notes. And yes, you'll get great stories. It's a great follow. And yeah, Maurice is like, he's an awesome person to just follow. Except when it comes to Arsenal, I still got to throw the Arsenal bullet.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it this year.
That Arsenal fans did a whole lot of trash talking to me back in the Nigerian days. I'll never let that go. So to everyone listening, thank you all for listening. Make sure you come back for the next episode next week, and keep the love coming in, sharing, stay positive. Thank you all for the privilege of your company.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to White Label American. If you enjoyed the show, we'll appreciate if you rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. If you have any questions, comments, or have someone who will be a good guest on the show, or you want to be on the show, send us a message at whitelabelamerican@gmail.com. And make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at White Label American. Thank you for your support.